are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone, this is Sarah Butler with Faith Trust Institute. I want to welcome you today to today's webinar, Human Trafficking and the Role of the Faith Community. I'll introduce our presenter in just a few moments, but first we need to go over some technical details. First of all, you should be able to hear me as well as see the technical information slide on your screen. If you're having problems with the sound, please check to make sure that your speaker or headphone is plugged in and that your sound is turned up. If you're having other technical problems, I recommend that you exit the webinar and then go to the link in your email and try to connect again. Sometimes that'll help. All the audience members are muted throughout the presentation, so if you have questions or comments, you can submit them to me using the question box on the right side of your screen, and we would love to hear from you. You can submit your questions anytime during the presentation. I'll hold on to them until the last 15 minutes when we have a question and answer session. If you don't see the question box on your screen, you should see an orange arrow, and that if you click on that, that will give you more features. The slides that you see on your screen during the presentation will be emailed to you as a PDF later this afternoon, so you'll have them as a resource. And lastly, we're recording this webinar to make it available on our website for those who can't join the live session. So we welcome those who may be listening to the recording. There's a growing awareness that human trafficking is happening in every community. We've gone from thinking that this is an injustice that only happens in faraway places to the recognition that it's all around us. We thought it would be useful to talk to Robert Beister of Seattle Against Slavery to look at how dedicated people are addressing this global issue in a local way and making a difference one person at a time. Robert Beister is the Executive Director of Seattle Against Slavery. He holds a Master's of Public Affairs from the University of Washington and left the tech world to work as a social justice advocate. Robert began working on the issue of human trafficking in 2007. His role with SAS began in 2010 as a volunteer public awareness campaign manager, and he's been Executive Director since 2012. He's a member of the Washington Statewide Task Force on Human Trafficking. So we're delighted that he is joining us today. And audience members, please send in your questions at any point. And Robert, are you there?
I am here. Thanks so much for the introduction.
Okay, I'm handing it over to you.
Great. So welcome, everyone. I'm really excited about the opportunity to talk to some folks who might be practitioners or folks connected to faith communities about the work that Seattle Against Slavery has done on addressing human trafficking in all of its forms here in Western Washington in Seattle. Sorry about that. There's a doorbell that I'm now going to turn off. Really working with faith communities has been an integral part of the anti-trafficking work that we have done since 2009 when Seattle Against Slavery was founded. If you have any questions for me and want to type them in the chat box as we go, I'll try to keep an eye on that and have things move forward. For the folks who are listening on the recording, at the end of the presentation, there's some contact information for me in case you need to follow up with any questions. All right, so let's see if we can get things moving with the slides. There we go. So a little bit of background on Seattle Against Slavery, or SAS, as I'm going to call it through the presentation. We are an organization that does community mobilization on the issue of human trafficking, focused on victims and survivors in our community here in the greater Seattle area. So the three main focuses of our work are education, advocacy, and mobilization. And I'll speak a little bit more about how each of those work. But the basic approach in how we're looking at the issue of human trafficking is that we try to focus not simply on the idea that human trafficking exists as like an issue in the world that people could be aware of broadly, but how can people in our community here make an impact on the lives of individuals. So thinking in terms of an individual case of someone who would be trafficked, and I'm going to explain a little bit more about what that means. what could we do to prevent that person from being trafficked in the first place? What can we do to identify and intervene so that that person can get out of a trafficking situation? And what can we do to help support a survivor of trafficking once they have been able to escape a trafficking situation? So part of the approach that we've taken since we began was really being informed by survivors of trafficking themselves about their own experiences and service providers who are working with survivors of trafficking on a daily basis. So Seattle Against Slavery isn't a direct service provider because we know that the organizations who are doing that direct service provision work often are constrained in their resources and their focus and expertise really is on the wraparound services that they provide for someone who's gone through the trafficking experience. We, as a separate organization, engage the community to help people understand how trafficking is working, where they live or where they work. We advocate to make sure that local and statewide governments have the right type of policies in place, both to prevent trafficking and to support people who might be exploited. And we try to connect with organizations like faith communities to say, how can we make your community, whether it's a church or a synagogue or a mosque, a place where trafficking prevention takes place, sort of a microcosm of the grassroots network that Seattle Against Slavery does. By being informed by survivors and service providers locally, we can make sure that any actions that government is taking, any information that we provide to the community, any group that it ends up being mobilized to do anti-trafficking work is informed by effective, accurate information that's really connected to what's going on the ground right where they live. Part of that we saw from the very beginning was raising awareness about the fact that human trafficking is happening in local communities. So a lot of the presentation that happens in media ends up being focused on international human trafficking, and our focus was really on victims and survivors living, right in the houses and apartment buildings where we ourselves are living, and letting that that's taking place ended up being a great starting point for them understanding how human trafficking is connected to other issues of violence, abuse, and exploitation that's going on in our community. Providing resources is another key piece. So like I said before, you have survivors who want to let people know their own experiences, but might not have the forum to do so. And so Seattle Against Slavery works with survivors of trafficking to create brochures, posters, online resources, and I'll show you some of those later, that really make it possible for people to understand the experience of human trafficking as it would be taking place, whether it's in Seattle or Los Angeles, Chicago. We just this week had a community in Idaho that we adapted some of our resources for. And then we create opportunities for the community to act. So I was speaking with someone right before this webinar got started about how some social justice issues can seem a bit overwhelming and hard to get traction on because the steps that you could take that would directly help people can be a bit challenging to identify. So we want to make sure if someone cares about the issue of trafficking, if it's on their heart and they have empathy for someone who's in that situation, that they know what they can do that would actually help that person to have the opportunity, because we believe fundamentally that everyone deserves lives of safety and freedom and hope, and we want people to help others in situations. So I'll start off by saying in a sort of definition of human trafficking that the presentation that we're most often given by the media and by even anti-trafficking organizations is that human trafficking is this image, which is a white girl who is probably underage, and that it's sex trafficking. But what we see locally, and it's mirrored nationally, is that human trafficking is much more broad and diverse. So even here in Seattle, we see predominantly people of color are trafficked more often than people who are white. So you have the same type of economic challenges that are leading to poverty and hunger, also leading to people being in situations where they're exploited. So We have immigrant and refugee communities here, and I'm sure many of you do in your own communities. Those people are at risk for trafficking because it's harder for them to connect to social services. We have people in agricultural communities who are being trafficked because they might not have the right type of documentation or might not feel like they can go to law enforcement without risk for themselves or their families. And so we see this very diverse set of people being exploited, and it ends up lining up with the reasons that groups within American society are often challenged to overcome other issues of violence and social injustice. And one of the last images in this next set that I would want to point out in particular is there's a young woman in this picture who is handcuffed and is being arrested and incarcerated for something. And we also see similarly that many times people are being arrested for crimes that are related to their trafficking situations. So people might be detained because they don't have the right type of documentation, and that's actually a threat that a trafficker will use to coerce the person into some form of labor. They might be arrested because they're being asked to do something or threatened into doing something, such as smuggling drugs or theft that is actually related to their trafficking situation. And so one of the places that we've been identifying many of the survivors of trafficking here in the Seattle area is in both adult and juvenile detention and in deportation centers where people have been detained because of immigration and documentation issues. And so in thinking about the totality of what human trafficking might look like in your community and how your faith community can connect to it, realize that issues of immigrant rights, issues of racial justice, issues of child welfare, those are all connected to the issue of exploitation and human trafficking. And I'll give a bit of a definition of human trafficking on the next slide. So human trafficking is a legal term, but what we know is that it didn't begin when people started using the phrase human trafficking. The legal term just means the use of force, which is any sort of physical violence, fraud, which is lying or tricking someone into doing something, or coercion, which is any sort of pressure to get someone to do a thing, whether it's shaming or debt or even threat of force, that's not actual physical contact. So any sort of threat of consequences. And it's to compel people into work in any industry. So like I said, it's often presented as sex trafficking and related to prostitution, but we here see people who violence is used against them, physical violence is used against them, to work as domestic servants, so nannies and housekeepers in homes, to work in agriculture. So just like the African-American slave trade of early America, we see people who, if they aren't working hard enough in the fields, are being punched, kicked, beaten. They have their family members experience physical violence. And around the world, we see in gang conflict and other armed conflict, in homeless communities with begging, that people are at risk of some sort of violence or are being tricked into working and giving their money to someone else because someone's lying in order to get them to work. Now the coercion piece connects to a lot of these things because simply that threat of someone being exposed, maybe for things that they've done sexually, maybe being outed with something that's a lie, like about their gender identity. Even in cultural communities, people saying that someone is a criminal and that they stole from a business. That type of coercion is all used to force people into work in a number of industries, including prostitution, strip clubs, and pornography. And I know this is especially a strong piece for many people in the faith communities who are working on the issue of pornography. The sex trafficking survivors who we work with say universally creating pornography at the direction of force, at the direction of violence, was a requirement in their trafficking experience. And so when people are thinking about the pornography they're consuming, it's important for them to have the perspective that that pornography may have been created, at the direction of, a fist or a belt or something like that. One distinction I would want to make, because this is an important legal distinction as well, is that with sex trafficking, adults fall into the category of force, fraud, or coercion. So if prostitution is compelled through force, fraud, or coercion, that's sex trafficking. But with minors, anyone who's under 18 throughout all of the United States, if they're involved in any sort of commercial sex, if they're creating pornography, if they're performing at a strip club, if they're involved in prostitution, that's always going to be human trafficking. Someone who is 16 years old who's involved in prostitution might be doing it to survive in some way. They might not think of themselves as a victim, but they are under federal law and most state laws able to receive services and support as a victim of trafficking or as a survivor of trafficking. And that distinction doesn't hold for labor. So if someone's 15 years old and they're working under the table for someone else, they're not technically a trafficking victim. They're just involved in child labor. So at this point, I would ask if anyone has any particular questions. I'll get into more of like the type of activities that faith communities have done and been involved with. But if people had any sort of definition questions about human trafficking, because I explain this to folks a lot, sometimes I miss things, feel free to type that in the chat window. I don't see any questions yet, so I'll move forward, but let me know if there are any that come up. All right, so a bit of perspective on what we know about trafficking here in Washington State, where Seattle Against Slavery works. The numbers around how much trafficking happens are really difficult to come by and confidently speak about because trafficking is an intentionally hidden crime. Traffickers don't want survivors of trafficking or even people who are currently being victimized to be able to communicate with the outside world. And so any numbers or estimates that you see are going to be, I will say, at the very least, vague estimates, and at the most, sometimes directly suspect. If people say they have facts about how much trafficking is going on, it's like saying they have facts about, how much cocaine there is in a given city. They might know trends and they might have hints, but actually getting a specific amount of something that's hidden like that, it's not possible, at least with the tools that we have right now. So the numbers that we use are really much more about people who can be individually identified as survivors of trafficking. So in the last 2-year reporting period here in Washington State, the largest trafficking service provider, Washington Anti-Trafficking Response Network, you'll see more in the slide, had made physical contact, so in-person identification, with 180 survivors from 29 different countries. Now these are just the people who had connected and wanted the possibility of services. So that is a very small amount of the larger field of people who needed support and may have been exploited in trafficking. At the same time, that's still people from 29 different countries in just one state, and so you can imagine the scale of this, with people from very diverse backgrounds, and the number of 180 survivors in one location, and those are just the people who are getting services from one organization. You can see that it expands very rapidly to a much larger number. Similarly, there was research that was done here in the Seattle area about youth girls involved in prostitution, and using the records of sexual assault resource providers and youth homeless service providers, those records were able to reflect a conservative estimate of 300 to 500 youth in any snapshot period just in the county Seattle is. And now that's just girls. Boys are trafficked, according to some studies, for sex at just as high rates. So homeless boys may be having survival sex when they're children at just as high rates. This also doesn't include trans youth, so people who don't identify as boys or girls. And it doesn't include adults, women, or men who might be involved in prostitution, and it doesn't include labor trafficking at all. So I'm listing those all out because you can see very quickly, as you would expand the circle of people who are being exploited, the numbers get very large very quickly. Here in that same county, we only have 12 dedicated spaces, or beds as they call them. So someone who is coming out of a trafficking situation would have dedicated housing. Housing is often found for a larger number of people, but you can see how there's a very limited scope of services that are available for a very large number of people who might need them. We also saw in 2013 and 2014 that the age of entry into prostitution was declining. So while the 90s showed that people who are 16 and 17 years old were entering prostitution at large rates, the homeless rate, the homeless age has declined quite a bit since the 90s. And so now we're seeing missing and runaway children who are 12 and 13 years old. And we're also seeing the age of entry into prostitution shifting down. So we're seeing a large number of 12, 13, 14-year-old boys and girls who are being pulled into commercial sex and, according to the legal definition, are human trafficking victims. Seattle is a major entry point for immigrants and refugees. I grew up in Chicago, so I didn't really think much map-wise about how close Seattle is to East Asia, but it is the place that a lot of people land in planes from all over East Asia and South Asia. And a large number of the people who are receiving services as trafficking survivors enter the country on visas, enter the country through many times legal means from both Central America and East Asia. And so we are an area that has a very diverse set of people who are foreign nationals who are being trafficked here. Just an additional study that is slightly more recent and has some specific information. In Portland, they did some research around, you'll see it says CSEY, that's commercially sexually exploited youth. And what they found in their study was similar numbers to what we see in Washington State, where victims being referred for services were 15.5 years old, and so the age of entry when they were starting to be exploited for sex was 13 and 14 years old. Their study found that 96% were female, but there were 3% male and 1% transgender. It's also important to note the service providers who provided this data primarily focus on serving women and girls, and so that might be a reason. But one of the most startling statistics is when people looked at the ethnic breakdown of folks and the racial breakdown. 27% of the people receiving services in the study were African American. The Portland metro area has between 5 and 6% African American population, and so this was 500 to 600% disproportionate. And we see the same thing in Seattle. The causes of human trafficking really are the people who are exploiting others for labor and sex. And those people who exploit others look for the types of vulnerabilities that we see in other areas of society. So people who are less economically able to sustain themselves, people who have less stable housing, people who have less access to law enforcement protection, and in the United States that ends up being communities of color, immigrants, and refugees. Also, just as a sort of creating the picture of folks who are survivors, 16.2%, so roughly around an eighth of the people had a baby or a child. And so in thinking about how you might see trafficking survivors in your community, this might be something that they present with. And also 50% in that area had a connection to a gang, that they were either being trafficked by a gang or they were participating in gang life as part of their survival method for their own home life. So now, to make a bit of a transition into the faith connection to this, I'll talk a bit about what some of our programs are like. Just 1 second, I'm trying to advance the slide. And did it work? Not so much. Sorry about that. Oh, there we go. So, like I was explaining before, a lot of our information about what survivors and service providers would want the community to do comes in the form of like interviews and listening sessions. And the faith community was really important in creating the environments for those interviews and listening sessions. So what we would typically do is create environments where people could share from the community and learn from service providers through monthly educational programs. And one of the things that the survivors said is a lot of the outreach materials that were being created were only in English, and many of the survivors were not English speakers as their first language. And so we worked on creating a multi-language outreach poster. It's called the No One Should Be Forced poster. And we wanted to find ways that we could distribute it in places where survivors were. And so faith communities often held these forums where faith leaders and even people who were just community members could learn from service providers and survivors of trafficking, and then volunteers in the faith community helped us create some of these materials, whether they had graphic design skills, whether they were people who worked with a print shop, or the faith community itself had some sort of printing ability, or they were the people who wanted to help distribute these in places where survivors could be reached. They all worked together on this program. The number that's on there, 888-3737-888, that's the number of a national trafficking hotline, and we wanted to use that so that we could make this a type of poster that could be replicated nationwide, and lots of people could use it. And also because that hotline has language translation staff of, I think now it's up to almost 200 languages. So anywhere in the country that might have a different language group. So like when we adapted this for Florida, there were groups there who wanted Portuguese speaking. When we were doing it in New York State, there were a number of East African languages that they want us to switch out for the languages that we were doing it. Here, the number can stay the same, and people can call and connect to local resources. So that's a really important part. The other thing that we learned from service providers was that many of their survivors were being moved as part of the destabilization. So if they were doing agricultural work in one area, they wouldn't be allowed to stay there that long. If they were involved in prostitution, they would be moved from city to city in Washington State, Bellingham, Everett, Seattle, Tacoma. But one of the universal factors that we know about people is that they need to use restrooms. And they were saying that that might be a place that we could reach them. So we worked with the state government, but one of the reasons a grassroots organization exists is sometimes state government doesn't want to spend money on different things. The state said, you can put up trafficking outreach in these multiple languages, but we don't want to pay to have it put up. And the price tag to put images like this up in some sort of way that would be permanent would be around $20,000. What we very quickly realized is that faith networks in the different cities around the state knew that there were rest areas in their communities, and we had different church denominations. I would like to specifically highlight the United Methodist Women because they funded nearly half of the rest areas in Washington State. Each of those individual churches would do a fundraiser related to the rest area near where they lived, and then they would know every time that someone stopped in a rest area that those permanent metal plaques that were in the rest area were supported by the faith community. It was a very specific, focused thing related to the issue that people in that community cared about, and then it was something that was lasting and that they could see statewide. I'll also say that now we've had 8 different states who have followed this rest area posting method, some of them using our materials and some of them creating their own. And so faith communities were really instrumental in creating this model and making it possible. And now all rest areas in Washington State have this type of plaque. And what we saw as a result was that people were not only reporting trafficking at much higher rates, but they were learning from those posters some of the signs to observe. So I put this slide in there because all of you might at some point be talking about human trafficking, or you might even see it yourself. But the idea that trafficking includes abusive or forced labor, that if someone is experiencing physical violence in the workplace, that is something that could be reported to that 888-3737-888 number. That there might be an employee or a person in prostitution who seems to be controlled by another person, is fearful of violence or some other consequence that's happening to them, or that they're submissive, that they, when you see someone in a work environment, that they are clearly being dominated by their boss or even in a relationship. And these are some of the similar signs that we see in domestic violence and sexual assault, but it's just turned commercial. It's made to be a way that people can be controlled for financial gain for the traffickers. Similarly, as people were seeing these posters, they also noticed that some people were unable to come and go freely from the place that they were working, and that turned into trafficking identifications and reports, and work conditions. If someone saw another person working in a place that was clearly dangerous or unsafe, or even they were forced to live or sleep in a workplace, that was a thing that people started reporting and could identify with those posters. And threats, even to the point that traffickers were so brazen that they were threatening people right in front of community members and people connected to faith communities. And we did trainings along with the postering so that people in faith communities would be able to have these same types of identification in the back of their mind and be able to teach other folks. And organizing trainings like this ended up being one of the reasons that in Washington State, in 2009, when Seattle Against Slavery got together, we had very low reporting rates. So we often had more survivors who were being referred from service provider to service provider rather than community referrals. But by the time these trainings happened with faith communities, by the time that all of these rest area signs were posted, we had over 600 calls in 2013, and that's been maintained through 2014 and 2015 above the 500 reports level to that 888-3737-888 number. And so having these different faith communities doing these types of trainings, supporting the materials and the awareness tools that are out where they live and on the highways and roads where they live has really turned into a very strong reporting environment here in Washington. And as a result, there have been more survivors who are coming forward, and then there's a need for more support for service providers, and then the faith communities are engaged in helping service providers, so it ends up being a cycle that can help support when trafficking is happening so that people are able to be identified and referred to services. I'll also say that we heard a really strong call from both faith community partners and others to do the type of work that would prevent trafficking before it starts. So we know that somewhere along the line, people are learning that it might be okay to threaten someone. It might be okay to be physically violent to someone else in order to take care of that trafficker's needs, in order to get money, in order to have their house be cleaner or their business make more money. They are willing to exploit other people. And we thought that one of the best times to have conversations with people who might be doing things, they might be buying trafficked sex, they might be trafficking people for sex themselves, they might be running a business where people are being exploited, would be high school. That people are making a lot of choices about their identity, the way that they see the world. And so we worked with national partners out of Chicago, the Chicago Alliance Against Sexual Exploitation, and some partners here in Washington State to develop a program called Trafficking Prevention for Schools, which is a multi-day program where we have conversations with teenagers about what they think about, men and women and people who don't identify as men and women, gender roles, what they think about different racial groups or people who are from other countries, whether they are documented immigrants or undocumented immigrants or people who are documented and are less documented now, and what they think about the idea of themselves as people who would help keep others safe, whether it's they would keep others safe by not doing things that would directly harm people, or they would help keep others safe by standing up for people within their groups of friends. So if someone that they knew said something that might lead to violence towards another person, or even did something that might put someone in harm's way or make them exploited, what did they think their responsibility was to take action, to speak up? And we've seen amazing results since we started implementing this about a year ago. The attitude shifts with young people have been really strong. And what we heard very quickly was that faith communities wanted this to be in their youth programs as well. And so the same type of programs that we do with schools, which is 4 45-minute sessions, we've now done with faith organizations, either in a one-day sort of extended workshop on how to develop compassion and empathy and have an identity where you help keep other people safe, which aligns up with all of the faith traditions. Or they've done it as part of programs that they already have, like if it's an afternoon youth program, since the sessions are 45 minutes long each, they'll do it 4 weeks in a row and they'll have conversations, and then they'll connect it to their faith traditions and other faith values by having things like a guiding text that is related to what we're talking about during that day. And so this is a real opportunity that we see, because faith communities, not just in the way that they can act in the world physically and make an impact, as I discussed further, but in terms of the identity and outlook and philosophy that youth have, especially in their development, faith communities play an integral role in shaping the ideas about what folks can do to help others and what specific ways they can be responsible for doing that in the world. So these have been really great programs, and they're conversation-based, and the youth bring amazing things that many people are not talking about in their day-to-day lives, certainly not in schools, and many times not in their faith communities either, and it's a great place to have conversations about those things. We also, because we work with a lot of youth, have been doing social media campaigns. So we're part of a national initiative called CSEY that's working on the demand for sex trafficking. And we've had faith communities come through really strongly with sharing these type of materials. The image that is up now is of a cat wearing a tie. His name is Business Cat, according to the meme. And the text says, "You think buying sex is cool, you gotta be kidding me." Now, it's a really serious issue, the issue of commercial sex and sex trafficking. But what we know from research about what people are sharing on social media and on the internet is that humor is much more shareable than things that people might see even as important issues in their lives. And by combining those two, it kind of puts into perspective why it might be ridiculous to think of exploiting another human being or people having sex with each other without any sort of connection or relationship or knowing that the other person is safe. That's a crazy idea. So why would that be cool? And faith communities have taken some of these things on, especially the ones who are really excited about the social media piece, and connected with their young folks by saying, what can we do on media so that people are not just hearing about, like, here's the events that are going on this weekend, but during the week, like, here's things that you can share and conversations that you can have that really bring home the things that we're talking about in sermons or the things that we're talking about in a text study. How does this live out in the world, especially a world where social media is so important? In Washington State, our target audience for this was men who are aged 18 to 24, and in the county where Seattle is, there are 110,000 of those men, according to the census. And in 1 2-month period, we were able to reach 54,000 of them with these appearances. So directly reaching or appearing in front of half of our target audience. And so when thinking about your own faith community, if you have young men especially, because those are the people who are primarily buying traffic sex, and you want to reach them and you want to add a faith twist to this, this is a way that we've found is very effective to reach those folks. Another faith-connected initiative that we did was using text messages to reach out to people who needed services. And so a faith-based service provider in the community said that they would maintain a cell phone and text back and forth with young people who might be exploited for sex. And Seattle Against Slavery volunteers used some software to reach out to people who were being posted online in ads being sold for sex, letting them know that services that were available and that they could receive support, whether they connected on the first time or the 5th time, just repeatedly reaching out and letting people know that there was a way that they could get help. And then this faith-based organization would help them find a place to stay, get them clothing, get them food, education programs, a lot of the things that faith communities are already doing, but with a specific focus on these most vulnerable people. As of right now, we are only doing this outreach in English, but again, there's the opportunity for us to do it in other languages with other faith communities that might directly serve people who speak other languages as their first language. But this resulted in over 80 positive contacts in the last year we were doing it, and in the last month, we had 3 people who connected with services who were being exploited in prostitution. That's in 1 month alone, using volunteers and using a faith community resource to help people connect. And so just to sort of wrap things up before we have a couple minutes for questions, the basic steps that a lot of the faith communities that we work with are involved in, there are 3 of them, and they are really sort of easy and straightforward to work on, and they don't have to be that deep, although you can get really deeply involved in this, as some faith communities can. The first one is know how to identify and report possible trafficking. So that can take the form of trainings. It can take the form of people delivering talks at during a service itself. It can take the form of having materials. We have brochures that are available on our website, and local organizations where you live might as well. And having that number so that people know this number exists, so that people report it. It's not, the SWAT team drops down and engages. It's really gathering information and giving people the opportunity to connect with services. And so if your faith community knows how to identify and report possible trafficking, and the one next door to you does as well, there might be a person who is coming in for church services or coming in for Friday prayer at your mosque who someone could identify that they are being exploited, that they are being abused or tricked, and that they might be able to get help if help is offered to them. So that's really important. The second one is change your product sourcing. So faith communities can send a strong message to their values and about the issue of trafficking by saying, we are going to spend church money, synagogue money, mosque money in a way that helps other people. And so if you serve coffee, if you ever have chocolate, those are two industries where there's very easy ways to get ethically sourced products. And if you don't, know that you are spending your faith community's money in a way that could very easily be exploiting other people. So there's rampant exploitation and trafficking in the coffee industry. There's really significant, like some people would estimate, above 50% of the non-fair trade chocolate in the world is coming from places where there's child labor, and just the basic production of chocolate in the world is coming mostly from West Africa, where there's really rampant, horrible abuses of children in order to get chocolate. So no one wants their faith community's money going into industries like that, supporting traffickers, supporting abuse, and this is a really basic, limited way. So if you just say, we're going to spend our money in a little different way to make sure that people are kept safe and actually help people be less vulnerable to exploitation, that sends a strong signal to the people in your faith community. Oh, the way that I buy and I spend my money should be involved in my faith life as well, and that buying things differently is a reflection of my ethics and my values and the way that I take care of others. And there are certain movements in the United States who they've made this their policy, or their national movements, that they send out information about, we will all be ordering our coffee from this vendor because it has fair trade certification and they made a deal with us. And so things like that can make a really significant difference for people who might be exploited in those industries. And the third thing is to end demand for sex trafficking in your community. And I know that this one might seem like a bit afield from the other ones, but it's actually pretty closely connected to changing the product sourcing. If people understand the integral connection between prostitution and sex trafficking, that trafficking only exists within prostitution, and that prostitution only exists because men are driving the demand for sex for money, you can have these conversations in your community about the harm that's being caused to trafficking victims, about the harm that's being caused to people who are buying sex when they get arrested or in their family or home lives, or even internally in the bad feelings that they get about purchasing sex and whether they know if it's trafficked or not. This type of shift, we fundamentally believe the faith communities can be a leader in, to have a conversation not just about, the sort of, this is illegal so you shouldn't do it, but really, a faith life requires that we think about the impact that we're having on others, and that we find, our best selves and do things that are going to help ourselves and others, and not contributing to the sex trafficking of others is a pretty straightforward one to do that. At the same time, a lot of the studies nationally say that 15% of men in the United States, 14 to 16%, will at some time in their life buy commercial sex, and it may be trafficked, because we know that much of prostitution is sex trafficking in the United States. And so the idea that 15% of men, which includes men in faith communities, are going to contribute to the sexual exploitation and trafficking of others, it seems like an obvious thing that we wouldn't want to do, and that we would want people to not engage in. So those are the 3 basic steps that I would encourage you to take. I strongly believe that it takes you as individuals and as faith communities to prevent trafficking in your community. And if you want to get in touch with me, my email is robertb@seattleagainstslavery.org, or you can find us on Facebook or Twitter or on the internet. So thanks so much, and I haven't seen any questions pop up in the chat so far. So now, if you have some final questions, I would be happy to answer.
Great, thank you, Robert. That was really informative. So I actually have a couple of questions that have come in to me. One is, if you are in an area that is not an urban center like Seattle, and this is an issue that you want to take on in your local community, where would you recommend people go to get information about what they can do, who they can work with, where they can volunteer?
Sure. So I would say the key partners that we've seen in Washington State, Washington is a very clear urban-rural divide. So we have literally a set of mountains that divides the urban area from the more rural area. And what we see here locally is that the organizations who are doing work with sexual assault and domestic violence survivors, as well as organizations who are doing work with immigrant communities, so immigrant rights organizations or immigrant legal services organizations, those 2 groups, those service providers, they often have human trafficking survivors in their communities. I would say in any place around the country, there's going to be organizations who are working with those groups, and so we always encourage people to go local. There are national organizations, and we have this slide up here with resources, with our website, with Polaris Project and Freedom Network, even some government organizations. But if there are local partners who are in your area and you say to them, we want to work on the issue of trafficking, what's some support that we can provide? Many times, I work for a nonprofit, so I know this. We will say, well, we have this thing that we'd like to do, but we don't have staff to do it, or we don't have resources to do it. And your faith organization might be the one that says, we're the ones who are going to go out in the community and distribute these materials, whether it's in English or Spanish or Amharic if you've got an Ethiopian community. We're the ones who will train on how to give presentations so that people can prevent human trafficking or identify survivors. I would say that those are the organizations who you can connect with. And sometimes state governments will have a list of those organizations. Polaris Project also has a state map, and you can see Polaris Project are the ones who run that hotline that I mentioned earlier. You can see who Polaris will refer survivors to in your state. And so you can go and look at, oh, these are the people who might be doing this survivor support work. I can connect with them. And I believe that they have points of contact in all 50 states. So they'll be able to refer you to someone. I've had conversations with folks sometimes where they say, but that organization is 400 miles away, even though they're in our same state. So again, I would say that the local organizations who are providing services to victims of other crimes, because they are all interconnected, that might be your best bet for where your faith community can make a connection and support someone.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that those organizations that are in urban centers are always looking for ways to reach out to rural communities. So if you are in a rural community, you can kind of be that connector for them, because again, staff resources are always challenging. I wanted to point out that on the resources we have a link to Know the Chain, which is something that you talked about, Robert, the know where your products are coming from. And we also have some articles available on our website and some TED Talks that I found on the Seattle Against Slavery website, which are really great and very good for sharing with people in your congregation. I've also included a couple of PDF fact sheets so that you can print these out. January is Human Trafficking Awareness Month, so this is a great time to bring the issue up, in your youth groups. Great time to preach on the issue. And if anyone in the audience has done work that you found particularly effective or engaging in your community, please let us know and we will share it as we can. There was a question about bystander education, Robert, something that we talk about all the time when talking about sexual assault and domestic violence. So your work with kids, would you just give me a little bit more information about kind of how these workshops impact the kids? And, you know, you said you have a lot of teenagers and high schoolers who are volunteering with you.
Yeah, you know, one of the key questions that we ask before we do the trainings and after is about, they're called how likely questions. We say, how likely are you to say something if your friend makes a sexist joke, or if your friend, you know, makes a joke about sexual assault or rape, like things that are related to forms of sexual or gender violence. And what we find is, for most youth, the idea that they would be pushed to the outside if they spoke up about something is really taught strongly to them, that most of us grew up, and I know I certainly have this idea, that if someone says something and they're my friend and I say, hey, that's not cool, or that's out of line, or I don't like people talking like that, that's, you know, bad news, that very rarely happens, because people think that you'll be you know, the square or the outcast. But what we find is that when we facilitate conversations about it, when we bring the reality to people and we say, like, how would you feel about someone saying something like that? Most of the time the youth are like, yeah, sometimes I say stuff and then I think about it and I think that's really dumb, or that's really mean, or I wouldn't want someone to say something like that about me or about someone I care about. And then the attitude change shifts very strongly, where, you know, it's statistically significant. We do all these tests on it, where youth are much more likely, once they have a conversation about, like, oh yeah, in that situation, I could see how that would lead to someone exploiting another person. I don't want that to happen. I'm more likely to say something. And we even practice it because, you know, just like fire drills for school, moving through the motions of something helps you be much more likely to do it right when it comes up. And so we have people say stuff that we think, you know, might be offensive or might lead to exploitation or an attitude of exploitation. And then we have people speak up and not just be a bystander. And those youth then, you know, we hear this from the schools, have conversations with people in other classes and create you know, projects and clubs and things like that to help other people speak out when things like that come up. And it really connects with anti-bullying, relationship violence, other kinds of sexual harassment and assault. It all is sort of the basic skills of taking those ethics that faith communities so strongly build and turning them into how you live your life and how you walk in the world. And so youth are excited to grab onto that. They like the idea of being, you know, like a hero and a stand-up person. You know, whether you're male identifying or non-male identifying, they all want to get that type of identity and be leaders and be looked up to by others.
Thank you. One last question, Robert. You were talking about this is an area where you feel you can see the impact that you're making. And I'm wondering if you could share some of your personal experience of the impact that you see that your organization, your volunteers are making.
Yeah, you know, it's a pretty incredible thing. There's, in a lot of work, whether it's anti-hunger work or anti-homelessness, I've worked on racial justice for a long time. The idea of some new big victory is often hard to come by. But in the realm of anti-trafficking, we have literally places that people can go that they couldn't go to before. We have government programs to help people, you know, like clean up their criminal records if they, while they were trafficked, were also arrested for the thing that they were being trafficked for. We have services that are available to people that really were the barrier between them leaving trafficking and not leaving trafficking, because they didn't know if they'd have a place to stay or food to eat or clothing. And now we can say confidently, like, yes, you'll have all these things if you are able to step out of the situation of violence. Those type of big wins, and, you know, governors and mayors all like stepping forward and speaking on these issues that they've never talked about before, it's kind of an incredible thing. And it's why, you know, we in the anti-trafficking world have really strong language that we use about this work, because it's sort of shocking to think about, but at the beginning of the 20th century, there were these conversations about sexual abuse of children and whether or not that was okay and if people could stop it. I mean, now we think like sexual abuse of children, everyone is against this. We'll do everything we can to stop it. And it occurs, but we want it to occur as little as possible. And it's totally anathema to our society and our culture and our ethics. But that there weren't even laws against it in many states, you know, in the early 1900s. And now it's universal. We're seeing the same thing with human trafficking, where we might not be able to eliminate all of it because there are going to be people who are trying to exploit others sort of always, but we could make it a very, very small thing instead of the epidemic levels that we're seeing now. And so it's exciting with all of these successes that we're seeing, you know, on not even a yearly basis, but on a monthly basis all over the country, that we really are developing some strategies informed by survivors themselves. You know, created by service providers who are working with survivors every day to prevent people from being trafficked, to help people out of a trafficking situation, and to help those who have escaped trafficking to have lives that are really rewarding so that they never have to be exploited again. Yeah.
Sorry,
So
sorry about. Sorry, I was having a little problem getting my mic to activate.
Oh, sure. No problem.
So we have a couple minutes left, and I have a question here about ways to talk about this for children who are younger than high school or even middle school. Would you say that the anti-bullying work kind of leads to a way to talk about safety, fairness, justice, all of that sort of stuff?
Yeah, it really does. I would say also, and you know, I'm not a parent, so this might be a thing that's challenging to people, but I feel like chocolate is the way. You know, kids, when you get them excited about chocolate, they can really see some larger things in the world because they're excited. There was a campaign that was done by a fifth grader in Australia that ended up making Cadbury Chocolate Company in Australia become fair trade for all of Australia for their dairy milk bars and some of their products. And her approach was very simple, that kids like her should get to go to school and play with their friends and people shouldn't hurt them. And so she didn't want to buy chocolate from anyone who made kids not get to go to school and have fun with their friends or anyone who would hurt other kids. So they only wanted to buy chocolate from people who helped kids have a good time and not have bad things happen to them. And I mean, it's honestly, you know, like from the mouths of children. It's so straightforward a concept and idea, and everyone can sort of understand it. And these elementary school kids started a thing that then was adopted by adults and by faith communities and turned into activism that really changed the behavior of a big company. And so I would say, you know, just talking about how people like to be able to, you know, see their family and have fun and have friends and go to school. And so we need to do the things that keep people safe. And these are some of the decisions. You know, it promotes a particular approach, which is like a fair trade chocolate approach, but kids also get to have chocolate. But we see there's an organization called Committee for Children that has a program. It's called Second Steps. That's in a lot of elementary schools and junior high schools that goes along with the anti-bullying and promoting empathy and creating healthy relationships. And it really has, Second Steps has the language and the sort of developmental appropriate content if you're looking for something that has very evidence-based curricula around it. But for us, a lot of times it just ends up being chocolate conversations with you know, 8, 9, 10-year-olds.
Well, who doesn't want to talk about chocolate? So
yeah,
that's great. So we are now at the noon hour. I want to thank you, Robert. I'm going to go ahead and mute you here. Thank you, Robert, for sharing your wealth of information on the ground, local actions that people can be involved in. So I really appreciate that. And folks, as you close the webinar window, you're going to be prompted to fill out a short survey. We'd be grateful if you took a moment just to complete it, give us your feedback about this webinar, any suggestions or for future webinars, questions that you'd like Robert to follow up with. And you can visit our website, faithtrustinstitute.org to see our upcoming webinars. I will be sending out the PowerPoint presentation this afternoon, and I'll include a link to a recording of today's presentation so you can share it with other people who weren't able to attend. This concludes today's webinar, and I want to thank you all for joining us. Have a good day.